The gravel of the sweeping, lime tree-lined driveway crunched beneath the heavy tires of the silver Bentley, a sound that usually signaled the triumphant return of the master of the estate. Yet Tudibhenen, beneath the oppressive, slate-gray English sky, it felt strangely like an intrusion. Alexander, a man whose net worth could comfortably purchase small nations, felt a peculiar tightening in his chest as the Elizabethan manor house came into view, its ivy-clad brickwork standing as a somber sentinel against the rolling hills of the countryside. He had returned early from the cutthroat pits of Wall Street, his soul weary, seeking the silence of his home. But the silence was not waiting for him. Instead, a sound pierced the stale, humid air of the late afternoon, a sound so pure, so alien to these grounds, that Alexander felt as if an invisible, spectral hand were squeezing his heart until the rhythm faltered. It was the laughter of a child. The English leather attaché, stuffed with multi-million-dollar contracts, merger agreements, and the heavy burden of corporate worries, slipped from his fingers. It struck the gravel with a dull, expensive thud that he did not even register. His eyes, sharp instruments accustomed to scanning complex financial statements and detecting the subtlest deceits in boardrooms from New York to Singapore, could not process the impossible tableau unfolding upon the immaculate, emerald green lawn of his own home. There, bathed in the golden, ethereal light of 4 p.m., was his son, Charlie. This was the same child that 5 internationally renowned neurologists at the Mayo Clinic and beyond had diagnosed with severe autism and a permanent, irreversible emotional disconnection. This was the child who was meant to be a husk, a vessel void of recognition. Yet here he was, clinging to a woman's back with the ferocity of a koala. She was not his fiancée, the poised and polished Victoria. She was not a specialized nurse with 3 doctorates and a clinical demeanor. She was the housekeeper, a young woman named Grace, whom he had barely looked in the eyes twice in the 6 months she had been employed. She was dressed in a cheap, fading pinafore apron and ridiculous, bright yellow marigold gloves that shone offensively in the sun. She crawled through the emerald green grass, ignoring the grass stains ruining her stockings and knees, making absurd horse-like whinnies. And Charlie, his little 6-year-old Charlie, who supposedly recoiled from physical contact as if it were fire, buried his face in the crook of the woman's neck and laughed uproariously, his arms thrown wide open, as if he wished to embrace the entire world. Alexander felt his legs give way, the strength leaving his body as the air caught in his throat. How was this possible? Just that morning, Victoria, his future wife, had reminded him in her tone of feigned, saintly patience that Charlie needed to increase the dose of his sedatives because his aggressive outbursts had become unbearable. She had told him with a tear in her eye that the child was a lost cause, an empty shell that brought only pain, embarrassment, and expense. But what Alexander had in front of his eyes was not an empty shell. It was a living, vibrant, happy child. He took a hesitant step onto the manicured garden, feeling the ground shift beneath his Italian loafers. The scene was as hypnotic as it was painful. Grace, the cleaning girl, paused for a moment to catch her breath, her chest heaving with exertion. Instead of coldly pushing the child away, as per the strict protocols Victoria had established, she turned her head and gave him a quick, affectionate tickle on his side with the tip of her nose. Charlie burst into a new wave of laughter, a cascading, bell-like sound Alexander hadn't heard since before his first wife's tragic accident 4 years ago. 4 years of silence. 4 years of lost gazes, rigid bodies, and clinical reports. And now, an employee wearing dishwashing gloves had achieved in 20 minutes what the best doctors in Europe and America had failed to accomplish in half a lifetime. A cold, glacial fury and a burning, terrifying hope clashed in the millionaire's chest. Someone had been lying to him. The truth was right there, laughing on the grass. Alexander resumed his march, this time with firmer, predatory steps, although his mind was a whirlwind of confusion and rage. Every meter he advanced towards them shattered a little more of the image they had sold him of his own son. Charlie's gaze wasn't lost in the void. His brown eyes, so hauntingly similar to those of his deceased mother, were fixed on Grace's face with absolute, unadulterated adoration. There was no trace of the muscle rigidity that justified the red wheelchair parked a few meters away, empty and forgotten like a bad omen. The boy held on tightly, his small fingers gripping the fabric of the pinafore apron. Alexander stepped fully onto the grass, and the crunch of the turf under his designer shoes broke the magic bubble. Grace froze in the middle of the movement. Her instinct was immediate and visceral, like a prey animal sensing a wolf. She sensed someone's presence before she saw him, and the bright, uninhibited smile on her face vanished, replaced instantly by a deathly pallor. She turned her head sharply, and her eyes met the imposing, backlit figure of Alexander, his face unreadable and his fists clenched at his sides. Pure terror filled the young woman's eyes. She knew the house rules were strict. They were ironclad laws. The cleaning staff were forbidden from interacting with the young master beyond what was strictly necessary for hygiene. Victoria had been very clear. If you touch him, you alter him. If you change his routine, you'll be out on the street with no reference, and I will ensure you never work in this county again. Grace let out a sudden sharp breath, gently lowering Charlie onto the grass, trying to put distance between her body and the child's, as if she were being caught committing a terrible crime. But Charlie didn't want to let go of her. They groaned, a clear, human sound of protest, and clutched her uniform sleeve again, smearing the cheap fabric with his dirt-covered fingers. "Sir, Mr. Alexander," Grace stammered, quickly getting on her knees, not daring to stand up completely, her yellow-gloved hands trembling visibly in front of her chest like a shield. "I'm so sorry, I didn't see the time. I didn't know you would arrive early. Please don't get angry." He just wanted to play a little. Alexander did not respond immediately. His silence was heavy, charged with an intensity that Grace interpreted as the prelude to a swift dismissal. She lowered her head, waiting for the shouts, waiting for the humiliation she used to receive from Mrs. Victoria. But the screams never came. Instead, Alexander watched his son. Charlie, noticing the tension radiating from Grace, had stopped laughing. His face changed, morphing from joy to alert concern. The boy crawled along the floor, moving with strength and coordination that the doctors swore he didn't possess, and positioned himself in front of Grace, raising his small arms like a shield, looking at his own father with distrust. That gesture hit Alexander harder than any insult, harder than any blow. His son, the emotionally disabled one, was trying to protect the maid from his own father. "Don't move," ordered Alexander, his voice sounding hoarse, almost unrecognizable to his own ears. It wasn't a shout, it was a plea disguised as a command. Grace stood frozen, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Charlie was still there with a frown on his face, a defiant expression that Alexander had never seen before. He had always been told that Charlie did not recognize people, that for him, human beings were indistinguishable objects. But the boy knew perfectly well who the threat was and who his refuge was. Alexander felt a bitter taste in his mouth, the metallic tang of regret. Guilt burned within him like acid. He had spent so much time traveling to Wall Street, so much time working to pay for treatments, blindly trusting Victoria and the specialists, that he had become a stranger to his own blood. Alexander crouched down slowly, ignoring how the fabric of his 3,000-pound suit was stretching and getting stained by the dampness from the garden. He brought himself to their eye level. Grace was breathing heavily, the smell of detergent and the faint scent of lavender emanating from her clothes. A simple, homey mixture that contrasted violently with the expensive, chemical perfumes that usually flooded the mansion. "Since when?" Alexander asked, fixing his gaze on the young woman. His tone was urgent, demanding. "Mr. Grace blinked in confusion, expecting a reprimand for the dirt or the mess. "Since when has he been doing that?" Alexander pointed to Charlie, who was now caressing the girl's rubber-gloved hand with a finger, seeking comfort. "The doctors, Victoria. They all told me that his muscles were atrophied. They told me that he couldn't support his own weight, that he couldn't focus his gaze, that laughter was an involuntary reflex impossible in his condition. Since when does he laugh like that?" Grace swallowed, realizing that the master's anger was not directed at her, or at least not for the reason she thought. She looked at Charlie with infinite tenderness, forgetting for a second that she was talking to one of the most powerful men in the country. "Always, sir," she whispered, and those two words fell like rocks upon Alexander's conscience. Well, since I started working here 6 months ago. At first he was shy, yes, but he's not stunted. He's just sad and very scared. Scared, Alexander repeated the word as if it were a foreign language. What would he be afraid of? He has everything he needs. 24-hour care, the best room, therapies. Grace hesitated. She knew that what she was about to say could cost her not only her job but her reputation if Mrs. Victoria found out. But she felt Charlie's little hand squeezing her finger, and that contact gave her a sudden burst of courage. She looked up and held the millionaire's gaze. He's not afraid of what, sir? He's afraid of whom? The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant song of a thrush in the hedgerow. Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine despite the afternoon heat. Pieces of the puzzle, those jagged shards that never fit together, began to align. The accidental bruises, the crying that magically stopped when Victoria left the room, her insistence on keeping him sedated. It all began to coalesce into a grotesque picture that he had refused to see. "Explain yourself," said Alexander, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And you'd better tell the truth, Grace. Because if what you're implying is true, he changes when she arrives." Grace blurted out quickly, the words tumbling over each other. When Mrs. Victoria is home, Charlie shuts down. He becomes rigid, closes his eyes, and doesn't respond. The doctors see it that way because she's always present at the appointments, right? She's always there holding his hand or touching his neck. Alexander remembered the doctor's visits at the Mayo Clinic and in London. Victoria was always the devoted fiancée, the perfect surrogate mother, stroking the boy's neck, whispering in his ear. She always touches his neck, Alexander thought, and a sudden wave of nausea washed over him as he recalled an old documentary about pressure points. It was possible. It was monstrous. But the laughter, that laughter he had just heard, wasn't lying. "I want to see more," Alexander ordered, standing up abruptly, startling Grace. "You said he's not atrophied. Show me what he can do. Now." "Sir, I'm not a therapist. We just play." Grace tried to excuse herself, afraid she'd said too much. "Do it," he bellowed, and then seeing Charlie shrink back, he softened his tone, running a hand through his graying hair in despair. "Please, I need to see him. I need to know I'm not crazy for believing my son is in there." Grace nodded slowly. She dried her hands on her apron, took off her yellow marigold gloves and left them on the grass, revealing soft, hard-working hands, red from scrubbing. She turned towards the child, and her posture changed. She was no longer the frightened maid. She was a playmate. She began to hum a soft melody, a popular lullaby that Alexander vaguely remembered from his own childhood. "Come on, Charlie. The plane is about to take off," she said in a sing-song voice, extending her arms. To Alexander's astonishment, Charlie didn't just smile. The boy placed his hands on the ground, tensed the supposedly useless leg muscles, and with a visible but determined effort, lifted his bottom off the ground. He got into a crawling position on his own. There was no help, no mechanical support. It was pure motor will. Charlie crawled 2 steps towards Grace, and then, glancing sideways at his father, emitted a guttural sound that slowly formed into syllables. "Oh, a plane." The word was clumsy, slurred, but unmistakable. Alexander put his hand to his mouth to choke back a sob. Mute. The diagnosis said mute, nonverbal, and there was his son asking to play airplane. Alexander's world, built on medical reports and blind trust in his fiancée, collapsed in that instant, revealing a brilliant and terrible reality. Charlie was healthy. Someone was deliberately keeping him sick. "My God," whispered Alexander, falling to his knees beside his son. He reached out a trembling hand toward the child's cheek. Charlie did not move away this time, although he kept his gaze fixed on Grace, seeking approval. She nodded slightly with a sad smile. Alexander touched his son's warm skin and felt an electric connection, a bond reforged. But before he could process the miracle, the sound of a powerful engine roared into the main entrance. A red Ferrari braked with a squeal of tires on the gravel. Charlie's body reacted instantly. The smile disappeared. His shoulders tensed and his eyes glazed over, returning to that empty, lost look that Alexander also knew. Grace turned as pale as a sheet. "It's her," whispered the housekeeper, clumsily picking up the gloves from the floor. "Sir, please, if she sees me playing with him." Charlie's transformation was the ultimate proof. It wasn't an illness, it was terror. Alexander felt his blood boiling in his veins, a volcanic fury that threatened to explode. But his years in business had taught him a vital lesson. Never attack when the enemy doesn't know you're there. He looked towards the house where Victoria's heels were already echoing in the hallway, and then he looked at Grace. "Get up," said Alexander. His voice was cold and calculating, a tone he used to destroy competitors on Wall Street. "Put on your gloves. Act like nothing happened and—" "Sir?" Grace looked at him, uncomprehending. "Listen to me carefully, Grace." Alexander gently grabbed her by the shoulders, looking intently into her eyes. "From this moment on, you and I are allies. Nobody, absolutely nobody, can know what I just saw. I'm not going to confront her today. Today, I'm going to start destroying her." Alexander stood up, dusted off his suit, and with one last look at his son, who had already returned to his feigned catatonic state, ran towards the side door of the cloakroom. "I'm going to enter through the office. She'll think I'm working. When she comes out here, I want you to watch everything, because tonight, everything is going to change." From the office window, hidden behind heavy velvet curtains that smelled of dust and antiquity, Alexander watched the scene with his breath held, like a sniper waiting for the moment to shoot. His heart beat with a violence that hurt his ribs, a dull drumming that accompanied the arrival of the woman he planned to marry in 2 months. The contrast was brutal, almost cinematic. The garden, which minutes before had been a scene of laughter and miracles under the golden sun, darkened metaphorically the instant Victoria appeared in the frame of the French door. She wasn't walking. She was parading, wearing red stiletto heels that viciously dug into the perfect lawn, ruining the grass with every step. A perfect metaphor for what she had done to their lives. She was impeccably dressed in Saint-Tropez fashion, with designer sunglasses that covered half her face and a handbag that cost more than Grace's annual salary. But what chilled Alexander's blood was not her clothes, but her body language. From the safety of his hiding place, he saw how Victoria's posture radiated a tense, electric aggression. There was no one else around, or at least that's what she thought. So the mask of a selfless and long-suffering mother had fallen to the ground along with her keys. "What the hell are you doing?" Victoria's scream pierced the double-glazed office window, muffled but unmistakably laden with venom. Alexander saw Grace shrink physically, a conditioned reflex of someone who has received too many verbal blows. The employee jumped to her feet, lowering her head with her hands clasped over her dirty apron. But the worst thing was Charlie, his son, the boy who 5 minutes ago was saying airplane and crawling strongly. He collapsed on himself like a house of cards. His shoulders slumped, his arms pressed against his body in a spasmodic rigidity, and his face, once illuminated by joy, became empty of all expression. The fish mouth, as the doctors called it, that glassy stare into nothingness. Alexander clenched his fist against the windowsill until his knuckles turned white. It wasn't autism, it was a defense mechanism. The boy played dead to survive the predator. "Look at him," Victoria squealed, pointing an accusing finger at Charlie that had a perfectly manicured nail. "It's disgusting, full of dirt and grass. I pay you to keep him clean, not to let him roll around like an animal." Grace tried to speak. Her lips moved in a silent apology, but Victoria wouldn't let her. The woman moved quickly towards the child. Alexander felt a visceral urge to break the glass and jump into the garden, but he forced himself to stay still. "Look at her," he ordered himself. "You need to see what she's capable of when she thinks you're not watching." Victoria reached Charlie and, instead of bending down to clean him up or gently scolding him, she grabbed him by the arm. It wasn't a maternal touch. It was a sudden, dry, violent pull. She lifted the child's arm as if it were a broken rag doll. Charlie didn't complain. He didn't cry. He simply let himself be manipulated, hanging inertly from her hand. That passivity terrified Alexander more than any crying. It meant that this was routine. It meant that Charlie had learned that resisting was worse. "You're useless," Victoria hissed, bringing her face closer to the boy's, although Alexander had to read her lips to understand the full sentence. I looked away for 5 minutes, and you already look like a little rascal. If your father sees you like this, he'll think I don't take care of you. And if he thinks that, the money for your sweets will be gone. Do you understand? She took a handkerchief out of her bag and began to rub Charlie's face hard, almost scraping his skin to remove a stain of dirt. The boy's head jerked with every sudden movement of her hand. Grace took a step forward, an act of suicidal bravery. "Madam, please, it's going to hurt his skin," said the employee, her voice trembling as it barely reached the office. Victoria spun around with the speed of a snake. "Shut up, you stupid woman," she yelled, throwing the dirty handkerchief in her face. "You're the one to blame. Go to the kitchen and prepare his drops, the double dose. He is too altered because of you. He needs to sleep before Alexander arrives. I don't want him to see him so defective." Double dose. The words echoed in Alexander's mind like a gunshot. He remembered the monthly pharmacy bills. Broad-spectrum pediatric sedatives. The doctor said they were to control his anger attacks. Now he understood that the anger attacks were fabricated. The drops weren't meant to calm him down. They were meant to extinguish him. They were meant to turn a healthy child into a silent piece of furniture that wouldn't disturb the plans of the future lady of the house. Alexander felt a hot, lonely tear roll down his cheek. He had been paying month after month to have his own son drugged. Alexander stepped away from the window, taking a deep breath to control the trembling of his hands. He had to go out there. He had to act, but he couldn't be the furious father. He had to be the cold strategist. If he confronted her now with shouting, she would cry. She would say she was stressed, blame Grace, and manipulate the situation as she always did. He didn't need her to dig her own grave. He needed irrefutable proof. He loosened his tie, unbuttoned the top button of his shirt to look tired, and opened the office door that led to the inner corridor, not the garden. He walked heavily towards the main entrance of the house, his shoes clacking against the marble, announcing his presence as if he had just walked in through the front door. "Victoria, I'm home," he shouted in a voice that feigned exhaustion and normality. The effect on the garden was instantaneous. Through the open door of the room, he saw Victoria let go of Charlie's arm as if it burned. In less than 2 seconds, her posture changed radically. She smoothed down her dress, ran a hand through her hair to arrange it, and put on a bright, rehearsed, perfect smile. She quickly crouched down next to Charlie and, with a gentleness that was nauseating to watch, began to caress the cheek that she had been violently rubbing seconds before. "Alexander, my love," she exclaimed, turning toward the house, her eyes lighting up. "What a surprise. You're here so early." Alexander stepped out into the garden, forcing his legs to walk slowly, forcing his lips into a tired smile. His eyes scanned the scene. Grace was pale, picking up her handkerchief from the ground, her eyes fixed on the grass. Charlie was still like a statue, staring at a point on the horizon. "The meeting ended early," Alexander lied, approaching her and kissing her cheek. He caught a whiff of Victoria's expensive perfume and had to fight the urge to vomit. "I wanted to see you both. How are you? How was your day?" It was a trick question, a simple test. Victoria sighed dramatically, placing a hand on her chest, playing the martyr. "Oh, love, it's been a difficult day," she said in a distressed voice, looking at Charlie with mock sadness. "The poor thing has been terrible today. He's been shouting all morning. He's been banging his head against the wall. I had to struggle to keep him from hurting himself. The doctors are right. His condition is worsening. I barely managed to get him out into the garden a minute ago for some fresh air. But look, he's not even reacting. He's completely out of it." Alexander felt his blood boil. He screamed all morning. Lee. Grace had told him they had been playing. He hit his head. Lee. He had no marks. He's getting worse. The biggest lie of all. "Really?" Alexander asked, crouching down in front of Charlie. The boy didn't look at him. He felt Victoria's presence like a toxic shadow hanging over them. "Poor thing, he looks exhausted." "He is," Victoria insisted, placing a possessive hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing lightly. Alexander noticed Charlie wince almost imperceptibly. "I told Grace to prepare his medicine. He needs to rest, love. Maybe we should admit him to that center near the Mayo Clinic that Dr. Vales suggested. I know it's expensive and far away, but I don't have the strength anymore. I'm worried about his safety. There it was, the final plan. Send him far away, rid herself of the problem forever, and be left alone with the millionaire and his fortune. Alexander looked at Grace. The maid looked up for a second, her eyes filled with panic, silently begging him not to believe the lies. Alexander held her gaze, a silent message of, I see you. I believe you. No, Alexander said, standing up and dusting off his knees. His voice was firm, sharp. We're not sending him anywhere yet. In fact, I want to spend the afternoon with him. Victoria's face tightened imperceptibly. But love, he's in crisis. It could be dangerous. You know he gets aggressive. She tried to dissuade him, taking a step between father and son. I don't care. Alexander walked around her and looked at Grace. Grace, don't bring the drops. Bring orange juice and stay here. I want you to be here too. It seems Charlie feels comfortable with you. Victoria gave a nervous, incredulous giggle. Grace? Love, please. She's just the cleaning lady. Charlie doesn't even know she exists. She's an object to him. Besides, she has a lot to do inside. The house is a mess. The house can wait, Alexander cut in. And this time he let a bit of his boardroom authority seep into his tone. He looked Victoria straight in the eyes, challenging her for the first time in years. I've noticed something strange, Victoria. The silence grew thick. Victoria blinked, her smile faltering. Strange? What do you mean? When I arrived, Alexander paused deliberately, enjoying the flash of fear in her eyes. I thought I heard laughter. A child's laughter. Victoria stiffened. Her calculating mind worked a mile a minute. Oh, that, she said quickly, regaining her composure. It must have been the neighbor's children. The wind carries the sound. Charlie hasn't laughed in years. Alexander, don't get your hopes up. His brain doesn't work like that. Perhaps, Alexander said, turning to his son. He bent down and, breaking all the rules Victoria had set, scooped Charlie up in his arms. The boy tensed like a wooden board, expecting a scolding or a blow, but Alexander hugged him tightly, pressing him to his chest, whispering close to his ear so only he could hear, ignoring the woman who watched them suspiciously. Airplane, Alexander whispered. Dad's here. The plane's about to take off, champ. Charlie's small body twitched, and then very slowly, almost imperceptibly, a small hand rested on the shoulder of Alexander's expensive suit. It wasn't a full hug, but it was a response. Proof of life. Let's go inside, Alexander said loudly, walking toward the house with his son in his arms, leaving Victoria standing in the garden, mouth agape. Grace, come with us now. Victoria lagged behind, watching them walk away. For the first time, control was slipping from her grasp, and Alexander, walking toward the mansion that had become a prison, swore that he wouldn't sleep that night until he found the bottle of pills and the security cameras he planned to install. The war had begun. The atmosphere inside the mansion was suffocating, a mixture of sterile luxury and silent tension. Alexander entered the main foyer with Charlie in his arms, feeling like his son's body was a rigid block of ice against his chest. Behind him, the sound of Victoria's heels echoed like gunshots on the marble, a constant reminder of the threat nipping at his heels. Grace entered last, closing the door with a gentleness that betrayed her fear of drawing attention, standing close to the wall as if she wanted to blend into the wallpaper. Take him to his room immediately, Alexander, Victoria ordered, her voice regaining that commanding tone disguised as medical concern. He's overstimulated. Look how he's trembling. That walk in the garden was a terrible mistake. Grace, get moving. Go to the kitchen and get the bottle of calming night drops and the new dropper. The boy broke the other one yesterday in one of his hysterical fits. Alexander went upstairs, feeling bile rise in his throat. Hysterical fits. Now he knew they were lies, but he needed to see how far the charade would go. He entered Charlie's room, a room that looked more like a clinic than a child's bedroom. White walls, furniture with rounded edges, toys locked in glass cabinets, and a persistent smell of antiseptic. He gently placed Charlie on the bed. The boy didn't move. He stared at the ceiling, his eyes wide, breathing shallowly. The terror in his gaze was absolute. Victoria burst in, taking up all the space. Come out, my love, she said, gently pushing Alexander toward the door. You don't like seeing him when I give him the drops. You know it gets difficult and it breaks your heart. I'll take care of it. It's my burden. I'll carry it for you." "No," said Alexander, standing on the threshold. His shadow covered the bed. "I'm staying today. I want to learn. If we're going to get married, I need to know how to take care of my child." A flash of annoyance crossed Victoria's eyes, but she quickly hid it with a sad smile. Grace appeared at the door with a silver tray. Her hands were trembling so much that the tinted glass bottle rattled against the metal. "Give it to me." Victoria roughly snatched the bottle from Grace. What happened next was etched in Alexander's memory like a horror movie. Victoria wasn't sweet. There were no songs and no patience. She grabbed Charlie's jaw with one hand, squeezing the boy's cheeks tightly to force him to open his mouth. Charlie tried to turn his head, letting out a muffled groan, his eyes desperately searching for Grace at the door. "Stay still, damn it," Victoria whispered, forgetting for a second that Alexander was there, or perhaps confident that he would interpret her violence as necessary firmness. Victoria forced the drip in. 1, 2, 3, 4 doses. The thick yellowish liquid disappeared down the child's throat. Charlie coughed, gagging, shaking his small body, but he swallowed. The reaction was almost immediate, too fast to be something natural. In a matter of seconds, the tension in Charlie's muscles disappeared, replaced by an unnatural flabbiness. His eyelids drooped heavily. The light in his eyes went out. He didn't fall asleep. He disconnected. It was as if someone had cut the wires of a doll. "See, dear," Victoria said, wiping a drop of the liquid that had fallen on her finger and putting the cap on the bottle. "It's for his own good. Without this, he would get hurt. Now he will sleep 12 hours straight. Peace be with him. Peace be with us." Alexander looked at his son, who now lay with his mouth slightly open, drooling slightly, turned into the vegetable that the doctors described. He felt a murderous urge to grab Victoria by the neck and throw her out the window, but he restrained himself by clinging to the doorframe until the wood creaked. He couldn't save him today. He had to save him forever, and for that, he needed irrefutable proof. He needed the world to see the monster. "You're right, love," Alexander lied, his voice lifeless. "You have a knack for it. I don't know what I'd do without you." Victoria smiled victoriously, putting the bottle in her pocket instead of leaving it on the nightstand. "Let's go downstairs. Grace will stay and keep watch. You and I need a glass of champagne. I'm exhausted." As they left, Alexander turned for a second. Grace was at the foot of the bed, crying silently. Alexander gave her an almost imperceptible nod. "Hang in there." Dawn arrived shrouded in a deathly silence. The mansion slept, or at least it seemed that way. Victoria snored softly in the master bedroom, under the influence of 2 glasses of champagne and the satisfaction of having controlled the crisis. But Alexander was wide awake, dressed in black, moving like a ghost through his own house. He had waited until 3 a.m. to execute the first phase of his plan. He went into his office and opened the safe hidden behind a painting. He didn't take out money, but a black case he usually used for industrial espionage in his companies. High-definition micro cameras the size of a button with real-time transmission to the cloud. He went first to Charlie's room. The door creaked slightly, but the bisoe under the effects of sedatives didn't move. Alexander felt a pang of pain seeing his son in that chemical coma, but he transformed the pain into precision. He worked quickly. He installed a camera in the glass eye of a teddy bear on a high shelf. Another was hidden in the smoke detector on the ceiling. A third, with a high-gain microphone, was discreetly placed behind the curtain, pointing directly at the bed. Then he went down to the drawing room and the garden. He placed devices in the lamps, in the picture frames, and one strategically in the kitchen, where he knew Grace and Victoria interacted most. Every angle was covered. Every lie would be recorded in 4K. On his way back upstairs, he passed by the hallway cloakroom. He knew Victoria sometimes left things there. He opened the medicine cabinet with surgical care. At the back, behind her 500-pound face creams, he found an empty bottle of Charlie's medication that she hadn't thrown away in the bin. Alexander picked it up with a handkerchief, careful not to leave any fingerprints, and put it in a sealed bag. He would go to a private lab tomorrow. He needed to know exactly what poison they were putting into his blood. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky a pale gray. Alexander was already impeccably dressed in his business suit, his English leather attaché packed by the door. His face was a mask of executive coolness. He went down to the kitchen where Grace was already making coffee, her eyes puffy from lack of sleep. "Good morning," Alexander said softly. Grace jumped in fright, almost knocking over the coffee pot. "Sir, good morning." Alexander approached her. There was no one else there. Victoria was still asleep. "Listen carefully, Grace. In 10 minutes, I'll come down with Victoria and tell her I'm going on a trip. Urgent business in New York, 3 days. Grace's eyes filled with panic. "You're going to leave me alone with her? Sir, please. She was very angry yesterday. If you leave—" He interrupted her, gently taking her hands. "It's a trap. I'm going to drive out, turn around and stay at the Folly, the abandoned guest house at the far end of the property. I've installed cameras throughout the house. I'll watch everything from my laptop." Grace stopped trembling and stared at him in astonishment. "Cameras?" "Yes, I need her to let her guard down. I need her to show her true self on camera so the police can take her away and she can never go near Charlie again. But I need your help. You have to hold on. It's going to be hell. She'll think I'm not there, and she'll go wild. You can handle it." "For Charlie," the maid, the plain girl in yellow gloves, whispered. She straightened her back. A fierce determination flashed in her eyes, one that no maid should ever have to display. "For Charlie, sir, I'll endure anything." "Good." Alexander heard footsteps upstairs. "Here she comes. Remember, I have to be convincing. If I yell at you or ignore you before I leave, it's all part of the act. Don't forget." Victoria appeared in the kitchen wrapped in a silk robe, yawning with feigned elegance. "Alexander, what's that suitcase in the entryway?" Her gaze traveled suspiciously from the suitcase to him. "There's been a problem with the Wall Street investors," Alexander lied, his tone perfectly attuned to frustration. "I have to fly to New York for an emergency video conference to sign the new agreements. I'm leaving right now. The jet is waiting at Luton." Alexander saw the exact moment Victoria's eyes lit up. It wasn't sadness, it was relief. It was the anticipation of freedom. "New York," she said, moving closer to embrace him, her smile peeking into his shoulder. "Oh, darling, how terrible. Just when I thought we'd have a few quiet days. But I understand, duty calls." "I'll be back in 3 days, maybe 4, he added, giving her room to make mistakes. "Take care of Charlie. I trust you." "I'll take care of him as if he were my own," she replied, and the lie hung in the air, thick and toxic. Alexander picked up his suitcase and walked toward the exit without looking back, knowing he was leaving his son behind. He was leaving him in the lion's den, but he also knew he would be the hunter waiting in the shadows. As soon as the Range Rover's engine roared down the driveway, Victoria turned to Grace, her perfect wife smile melting like wax in a fire, revealing the cruel sneer beneath. "Good. Stupid," Victoria said, pulling out her phone. "The boss is gone. Today's my day. Clean the big drawing room and bring out the expensive wine from the cellar. I'm inviting my friends over, and as for the kid, lock him in the basement. I don't want his screaming ruining my party." The air in the Folly was stale, permeated with a smell of old wood and confinement that contrasted violently with the air-conditioned freshness of the main mansion just 200 meters away. Alexander didn't turn on any lights. He couldn't risk being betrayed by a glimmer. He sat down in an old wicker chair that creaked under his weight, illuminated only by the glow of his laptop screen beside him. His eyes, red and dry from lack of blinking, were fixed on the mosaic of images transmitted by the hidden cameras. What he saw was torture designed to shatter his soul, but he couldn't look away. He was the silent witness to his own tragedy. On the top left monitor, the kitchen camera showed Grace. The young woman was crying, but she did so silently, with that terrifying resignation of someone who has learned that noise only brings more punishment. She was carrying Charlie in her arms. The child, completely inert from the overdose of sedatives that Victoria had administered to him, had his head drooping backwards, swaying dangerously with each step of the employee. He looked like a small corpse. Alexander felt an electric impulse to run away, to break down the door and kill everyone with his own hands. a primal and savage instinct that burned in his guts. But he forced himself to stay seated. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that the old wood began to splinter under his fingernails. Not yet, he repeated to himself, biting his lip until he tasted the metallic tang of blood. I need you to do it. I need you to commit the final crime in front of the camera. I said to the basement. Victoria's voice, captured by the ambient microphone hidden in the lamp, sounded metallic and distorted, but charged with a clear cruelty. On the screen, Victoria appeared behind Grace, nudging her with the tip of her finger on the back, like someone herding cattle. She was carrying a glass of wine in her hand and moving with obscene lightness, humming a popular song. Madam, please, the basement is very damp, Grace pleaded, stopping in front of the solid wooden door that led into darkness. The child has weak bronchi. If we leave him down there in this cold, I don't give a damn about his lungs, Victoria exploded, and her face contorted on the screen. Do you think I'm going to let my guests see that freak drooling on the sofa? It's a class party, Grace, not a charity hospital. Put him in there, close the door, and go upstairs to prepare the canapes. And if you dare open that door before I tell you to, I swear I'll have you accused of theft. I have a lost gold watch, you know. It would be a shame if it turned up in your bag. The threat was clear. Jail. Grace lowered her head in defeat. Alexander saw the employee open the basement door. The camera did not have an angle towards the stairs below, but the audio captured the sound of footsteps descending into darkness. A minute later, Grace came upstairs alone with empty hands and her face covered in tears. Victoria locked the basement door, tucking the key into the neckline of her dress with a triumphant smile. Okay, problem solved. Now to clean. I want this kitchen to shine. Alexander closed his eyes for a second, feeling a deep nausea. His son, his little Charlie, locked up like an animal in a dusty, damp basement, drugged and helpless. Impotence was a poison running through his veins, but it was interrupted by the sound of a notification on his phone, an urgent email. The sender was Dr. Salazar, the head of the private laboratory to which he had sent the samples that same morning via a trusted messenger. The email subject line read, "Toxicology results, urgent, critical level." Alexander opened the file with trembling fingers. He didn't need to be a doctor to understand the red bars crossing the graph. Patient, Charlie, 6 years old, sample residue in vial and saliva on tissue. Positive results for clinophenol and diazepam at concentrations 3 times higher than the safe limit for an adult. Traces of central nervous system suppressants not approved for pediatric use. Note, continued use of this combination not only causes temporary motor paralysis in a catatonic state, but is generating cumulative neurological damage. At these doses, the risk of respiratory arrest during sleep is 80%. Alexander dropped the phone onto the table. It wasn't just abuse. It wasn't just neglect. It was slow-motion murder. Victoria wasn't controlling Charlie. She was killing him little by little, erasing his brain, shutting down his lungs, making sure that if he didn't die, he would be so damaged that he could never claim his inheritance or tell the truth. The woman he slept with, the woman who pretended to love him, was executing his son day after day. The strategist's coldness vanished. Now only the father's fury remained. Alexander stared at the monitor where Victoria poured herself another glass of wine, laughing to herself in the kitchen. He already had the toxicology reports. Now he had the video of the confinement. He had enough to send her to prison for years, but it wasn't enough. He wanted to destroy her. He wanted her friends, that high society before whom she pretended to be perfect, to see the monster she was. He wanted a public humiliation so devastating that she wouldn't be able to hide under any rock. He looked at the clock, 7:02 p.m. The guest cars would start arriving any minute. The party was about to begin, and Alexander, from his dark cave, prepared to be the conductor of the orchestra in the inferno that was about to unfold. Night fell over the property like a heavy shroud, concealing the moral ugliness beneath perfectly designed garden lights. From his laptop screen, Alexander watched as the facade of his house transformed. Victoria had turned on the decorative lights, creating a fairy tale atmosphere that contrasted starkly with the reality of the basement. The first luxury cars began to glide down the driveway. Mercedes, Bentleys, convertibles driven by women dressed as if they were going to a charity gala, oblivious to the fact they were entering a crime scene. The sound of lounge music began to filter through the room's microphones. Alexander turned up the volume on his headphones so as not to miss a word. He needed to hear everything. He needed ammunition. Victoria greeted her friends at the front door with effusive hugs and air kisses that didn't touch skin. "Welcome, come in," exclaimed Victoria, radiant in an emerald green silk dress. "The house is all ours. The boss went to New York to make more money for us, and the package is resting." "The package?" asked a blonde woman with too many jewels, letting out a cruel little laugh as she accepted a glass of champagne from a tray Grace was holding. "You know the kid," Victoria replied, lowering her voice in a conspiratorial tone as they walked toward the drawing room. "He was unbearable today, screaming, drooling, a nightmare. I had to give him his special medicine and put him away where he won't bother anyone. Honestly, girls, it's a sacrifice none of you would understand. Living with a child like that is like living with a broken pet. But hey, Alexander feels guilty, and that translates into compensation." Victoria gestured broadly to the living room renovations, the new furniture, and her own diamond necklace. The friends laughed, a sound like silk-clad hyenas. "You're a saint, Victoria," said another tall, dark-haired woman. "I would have sent him to a state boarding school and thrown away the key. How do you put up with him?" "Patience, dear. Patience and strategy," Victoria said, winking at the hidden camera in the painting, unaware that her fiancé was recording every pixel of her confession. "As soon as we're married and Alexander gives me full control of the medical trust, let's just say little Charlie is going to need a more favorable climate in Switzerland, far away from here and very cheap, even if the bills say otherwise." Alexander felt his temples throb. There it was, the financial confession, fraud, premeditation. He had it all. He could call the police right now. He could walk in with a shotgun, but his gaze shifted to the lower right monitor, the basement. There was no light down there, but the camera had infrared night vision. The image was grainy, in shades of gray and ghostly green. Charlie was moving. The sedative was wearing off faster than usual. Maybe it was the adrenaline of fear, or maybe his body was developing a tolerance to the poison. The boy was sitting on the old mattress they used to store winter clothes. He was hugging his knees, rocking frantically. Alexander brought his face close to the screen. He could see the pure terror in his son's eyes, which shone in the darkness like those of a frightened cat. Charlie stared at the closed door at the top of the stairs, and then the boy did something that broke Alexander's heart into 1,000 pieces. He began pounding his fists on the floor, but silently. He opened his mouth to shout, "Dah!" but no sound came out. Or perhaps he was too afraid the witch would hear him. Upstairs, the party was in full swing. The music had turned up. Grace passed among the guests with trays of canapes, invisible to them, treated like just another piece of furniture. But Alexander noticed something about the employee's posture. Grace wasn't looking at the guests. She was looking at the clock, at the basement door. She was tense, like a spring about to snap. Taking advantage of Victoria being busy recounting an anecdote about her last trip to Saint-Tropez, Grace placed the tray on a side table and slipped toward the kitchen. Alexander quickly switched cameras to follow her. He saw her desperately rummaging through the drawers. She wasn't looking for food. She was looking for something metallic, a screwdriver, a knife, something to pick the lock. "Don't do it, Grace. She's going to kill you," Alexander whispered into the screen, his heart in his throat. He knew that if Victoria caught her trying to open the door, the violence would be immediate. But Grace didn't stop. She found an old butter knife and ran to the basement door. She tried to force the tip into the lock, her hands trembling violently. The metallic sound, though faint, echoed in the silence of the kitchen. Crack. The sound didn't come from the door. It came from the kitchen entrance. "What do you think you're doing, you filthy traitor?" Alexander saw Victoria appear in the doorway, her face contorted with demonic rage. She had heard. She had followed the maid. Grace dropped the knife, which fell to the floor with a thud that sounded like a gunshot. "Madam, I heard a noise. I thought the child had fallen," Grace stammered, backing up until she bumped into the basement door, shielding it with her body. "You thought? You're not here to think. You're here to serve." Victoria hissed, advancing toward her. She was still holding her wine glass. Her elegance had vanished. Now she was a predator, cornering her prey. I told you not to open that door. I told you that if you did, you'd regret it. Do you think you can defy me in my own house? He's awake, madam, Grace said, and for the first time she raised her voice. She didn't shout, but she spoke with a firmness that made Victoria stop for a second. He is awake and afraid. He's a child. You can't just leave him there in the dark. It's inhumane. Inhuman? Victoria let out a raucous laugh that made the blood run cold. It's inhumane to have to take care of a person who is good for nothing. He's a genetic mistake, and you're a workplace mistake. And I'm going to correct both of them right now. Victoria raised her hand, not to slap her. Alexander saw the glimmer of the glass. She was going to hit her with the wine glass. She was going to cut her face. Alexander didn't wait any longer. He didn't think. He didn't plan it. He left the folly like a missile without closing the door, without turning off his laptop. He ran through the dark garden, leaping over hedges, ignoring the pain in his lungs, driven by a single need to get there before the blood stained his kitchen floor. While running, he took out his phone and dialed a pre-recorded number with a single key. Security, block the exits. No one is allowed to leave the property. I repeat, nobody leaves. Activate the red protocol. He reached the back terrace in seconds. Through the windows, he saw the guests chatting, oblivious to the violence happening just meters away from them. Alexander didn't use the door. He took a wrought iron chair from the patio and threw it with all his brute force against the tempered glass window of the drawing room. The sound of breaking glass was louder than the music, louder than the laughter. It was the sound of Judgment Day coming home. The guests screamed, covering their heads, as a shower of crystals fell onto the Persian carpet. Alexander entered through the broken hole, bleeding from a cut on his hand, with the look of a madman and the posture of an executioner. Victoria's friends froze, their glasses halfway to their mouths. "Alexander!" one of them squealed. "Oh my God, what's happening?" Alexander didn't look at them. He crossed the room like a storm, knocking over a table in his path, and headed straight for the kitchen. He arrived just as Victoria had Grace by the hair, holding the glass raised to hit her. "Let her go!" roared him Alexander, a scream so visceral that it made the walls vibrate. Victoria turned around and the glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. Her face went from the red of anger to the white of absolute terror, and it went in a fraction of a second. She saw Alexander covered in dust, with a bleeding hand, breathing heavily, and in his eyes she did not see her betrothed. She saw her end. The silence that followed Alexander's scream was more deafening than the shattering of the glass moments before. In the kitchen, time seemed to freeze in a bubble of unbearable tension. Victoria, with her hand still raised where seconds before she had held the glass, looked at Alexander as if she were seeing a ghost risen from the grave. Her face, a mask of perfect makeup, began to crumble, revealing the pure panic that throbbed beneath. Grace, huddled against the basement door, sobbed silently, her eyes wide, unable to process that the master was there, bleeding and furious, instead of flying to New York. "Alexander, my love," Victoria began, her voice trembling in a pathetic attempt to regain its usual honeyed tone. She lowered her hand slowly, forcing a smile that looked like a grimace of pain. "Oh my God, you gave me such a fright. Why did you come in like that? Are you hurt? Look at your hand." She took a step towards him, extending her arms as if she wanted to hug him, desperately trying to restore normalcy, to turn the domestic violence scene into an unfortunate misunderstanding. "Don't come any closer," said Alexander. His voice was not a scream. This time it was a low, guttural growl, laden with such a real threat that Victoria stopped dead in her tracks, stumbling over her own heels. "If you take one more step, Victoria, I swear I'll forget I'm a gentleman." Victoria paled. She glanced toward the room where her friends were crowding in the doorway of the kitchen, whispering with the champagne glasses they had forgotten in their hands. The audience was watching. She had to act fast. "Alexander, please, you're upset," she said, turning up the volume so the guests could hear her, adopting her role as victim. "I understand you're stressed about work, but look what you've done. You've scared Grace. The poor girl was having a nervous breakdown. She tried to steal silver cutlery and I had to stop her. I was just trying to protect our home." It was such a quick, such a fluid lie that for a second, Alexander felt a disgusting admiration for her ability to manipulate. Grace gasped, shaking her head frantically. "Lies!" shouted the employee, finding her voice through her tears. "Sir, the key is in her dress. Charlie is downstairs." The mention of the child's name broke the last thread of Alexander's patience. He ignored Victoria, ignored the gaping guests, and walked towards his fiancée. There was no tact. Alexander grabbed her wrist with his good hand, squeezing tightly. "The key," he demanded, looking her in the eyes with an intensity that burned her. "Let go of me, you're hurting me," Victoria whimpered, writhing. "I don't know what you're talking about. The child is asleep in his room." Alexander didn't wait. He saw the metallic glint peeking out from the neckline of her designer dress. With a sudden movement, he reached in and ripped off the small bronze key that hung from a thin chain, breaking the clasp. Victoria screamed more from humiliation than from pain and put her hands to her chest, backing away towards the counter. "He's an animal!" Victoria yelled to her friends. "Call the police! He's gone mad!" Alexander didn't even look at her. He turned to Grace, briefly placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of, "You're safe," and then inserted the key into the lock of the basement door. The mechanism turned with a metallic click. Alexander yanked open the door, and the smell of dampness and darkness hit his face. "Charlie!" he screamed into the black abyss. There was no response, only the distant hum of the boiler. Without hesitation, Alexander rushed down the stairs, stumbling in the darkness, guided by instinct. His hands touched the cold stone walls. When he got downstairs, he looked for the switch, but the light bulb was either burned out or broken. He took out his phone and turned on the torch. The beam of white light cut through the black, cluttered space filled with old boxes and furniture covered with sheets. "Charlie, son, I'm your dad." His voice broke. Then he saw it. In a corner behind a pile of rolled-up carpets, there was a small, trembling bundle. Charlie was huddled up like a young bull with his face hidden between his knees, covering his ears with his hands. The child rocked back and forth, emitting a low, steady hum to block out the outside world. Alexander knelt in front of him, feeling his soul break. The ground was frozen. Charlie was wearing only his thin pajamas. "Champ," whispered Alexander, stretching out his hand, but stopping before touching him so as not to scare him. "That's it. It's over. Dad came for you." The plane landed. Charlie stopped rocking. Slowly, very slowly, he raised his head. The light from the torch illuminated his dusty face with traces of dried tears on his cheeks. His eyes, dilated by fear and the after effects of sedatives, focused on the light and then miraculously found Alexander's face. "Dad!" the boy croaked, his throat dry. Alexander dropped the phone and hugged him. It was a desperate hug, complete. Charlie didn't freeze. This time he clung to his father's neck with surprising strength, burying his face in his shirt, stained with blood and sweat, sobbing with a relief that no 6-year-old should ever have to feel. "Let's go upstairs," said Alexander, lifting him into his arms. Charlie weighed very little, far too little. "We're going to get out of here." He walked up the stairs with a firm step, carrying his son as if he were the most valuable treasure in the universe. As he crossed the threshold of the basement door and stepped back into the bright light of the kitchen, the scene had changed. Victoria was no longer alone against the counter. She was surrounded by her friends, who comforted her while she cried crocodile tears while fixing her dress. "And that's why I locked him up, because he tried to bite me," Victoria was saying between faint sobs. "It's dangerous, girls. Alexander doesn't understand. His guilt as a father blinds him." Victoria's voice died in her throat when she saw Alexander come out of the basement with the child in his arms. The silence fell again, heavy and accusatory. Charlie, dazzled by the light, hid his face in his father's neck. His pajamas were stained with cobwebs in his hair. He looked like a street kid, not the heir to a fortune. Victoria's friends recoiled in horror. The image was too powerful to be ignored. There was no dangerous child. There was a terrified child and a father willing to kill for him. "Let's go to the drawing room," Alexander said with a cold calm that was more frightening than his previous shouts. It wasn't an invitation. It was an order. "All of you." "I'm not going anywhere with you now," Victoria spat, trying to regain control. "Are you drunk or high? Look at the state you've put the child in. You are making him dirty with your blood. Give him to me. I am his legal mother in the absence of—" Victoria tried to grab Charlie's leg. "Grace," called out Alexander, ignoring Victoria and walking towards the drawing room, forcing the guests to move aside. "Come here." The employee, wiping her tears with her apron, straightened up and walked behind him, passing Victoria with her head held high for the first time in her life. Victoria was speechless, watching her authority evaporate, but the villain wasn't ready to give up. Public humiliation was her worst nightmare, and she wasn't going to let it happen. With a look of pure hatred, she followed the group into the main room, where the enormous 85-inch television screen dominated the dark and silent wall, waiting to be switched on. The main drawing room, decorated with exquisite taste and fresh flowers that cost a fortune, had been turned into an impromptu courtroom. Alexander stopped in the center of the room under the crystal chandelier. He gently lowered Charlie to the ground and sat him on the beige velvet sofa, a piece of furniture that Victoria had always forbidden the child from touching for fear of stains. Charlie shrank back on the cushion, looking around with wide eyes searching for Grace. The employee immediately stood beside him, kneeling on the carpet and taking his hand. The boy sighed, instantly calming down at the familiar touch of the rubber gloves she had forgotten to take off, or perhaps had decided to leave on as her armor. Victoria's guests, 5 women from local high society, stood in an awkward semicircle, unsure whether to leave or stay and watch the show. Morbid curiosity kept them anchored to the ground. Victoria burst into the room with bloodshot eyes. She had lost her elegant composure. Now she was a cornered beast. "Enough of this theater," she shouted, pointing at Alexander. "Get out of my house, all of you out. This is a private family matter. Alexander is having a psychotic episode. Look at him. He's dirty, bleeding, delirious." Alexander looked at her with exasperating calmness. He wiped the blood from his hand on his trousers and took his phone out of his pocket. "Nobody is leaving," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "At least not until you see why my son was locked in a basement while you were drinking champagne." Alexander walked towards the television. Victoria understood instantly what was going to happen. Her eyes shifted towards the hidden camera in the picture frame above the fireplace, a detail she had overlooked 1,000 times. The color left her face. "Don't you dare," Victoria shrieked, lunging towards him to try to take his phone. "It's illegal. You can't record me in my own home." But before she could reach Alexander, Grace stood up. It was a quick, fluid movement. The maid, the invisible woman, stood in the way of the lady of the house. "Don't touch him," Grace said. She didn't scream. She said it in a firm, steely voice. Victoria stopped in disbelief. The employee's audacity blinded her with rage. "You," Victoria hissed, saliva dripping from her mouth. "Do you dare give me orders? You're a starving woman I picked up off the street. Get out of my way or I swear I'll kill you." Victoria raised her hand again, this time with a closed fist, ready to hit Grace in the face, ready to unleash all her frustration on the weakest link. "Mummy, no!" The scream didn't come from Grace, it came from the sofa. It was Charlie. The boy had stood up on the cushions. Mummy hadn't shouted calling for Victoria. He had shouted to defend Grace. Victoria froze, her fist in the air, and glared at the child with hatred. "You little monster," she murmured. "This is all your fault. If you were normal, none of this would be happening. You should have died with your mother." The cruelty of the phrase provoked a stifled scream among the guests. "Be quiet!" Alexander connected the cable to his phone with a quick, sharp movement. The giant screen came to life, but Victoria, in a final act of madness, lunged not at Alexander but at Charlie. If she had the child, she had the power. If she took him as an emotional hostage, Alexander wouldn't be able to do anything. "Come here," she yelled, grabbing Charlie's arm violently, trying to drag him from the sofa. Charlie yelped in pain. Grace didn't hesitate. She lunged at Victoria, shoving her with her shoulder. Victoria, thrown off balance by her heels in the shock, stumbled and fell backward onto the glass coffee table, which shattered beneath her weight. The crash was deafening. Victoria lay among the shards, dazed but furious, shouting curses. Grace immediately positioned herself in front of Charlie, shielding him with her own body, breathing heavily through clenched fists. "Nobody touches the boy!" Grace screamed with the ferocity of a lioness. "Nobody!" Alexander looked at Grace with deep, almost reverential respect. Then he looked at Victoria's friends, who were watching the scene in horror. "Do you want to know who your friend really is?" Alexander asked, pressing play on his phone. "Look at the screen and don't look away." The image on the television flickered and displayed a clear recording. In 4K, it was from just a few hours earlier. Victoria was in the kitchen with a glass of wine, laughing to herself as she held the bottle of sedatives. The audio filled the room with crystal clarity. "As soon as we're married and Alexander gives me full control, little Charlie is going to need a more favorable climate in Switzerland, and very cheaply, even if the bills say otherwise." Victoria's friends gasped. On the floor, amidst the broken glass, Victoria stopped screaming. She stared at the screen, paralyzed, watching as her own voice pronounced her social death sentence. But Alexander didn't stop there. "That was the fraud," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "Now watch the torture." He swiped his finger across the phone screen. The video changed. Now it showed Charlie's room the night before. Victoria entering, forcing the liquid over the boy's mouth, shoving it down his throat, pushing him against the pillow as he tried to fight. The terror was visible in the boy's eyes. "Stay still, damn it." One of the guests started to cry. Another turned away, unable to look. "Turn it off!" Victoria yelled from the floor, trying to get up, cutting her hands on the broken glass. "It's a setup. It's artificial intelligence. They want to ruin me." "No, Victoria," Alexander said, walking toward her and looking down at her, like one looks at a disgusting insect. "You've ruined yourself, and I have one last surprise for you." Alexander gestured toward the front door. The blue and red lights of a police car began flashing through the broken windows of the drawing room. He hadn't called private security. He had called the authorities. "Game over," Alexander said. "Grace, take Charlie. Let's go to the garden. I don't want my son to see them being taken away to the rubbish." The sound of sirens abruptly stopped in front of the main entrance, replaced by the sharp slam of car doors and commanding voices echoing outside. Inside the drawing room, the giant screen continued to project the horror on a loop. The grainy image of Charlie twitching in the darkness of the basement, hitting the floor silently. Victoria's friends, women who minutes before had been holding crystal glasses and talking about trips to Saint-Tropez, now backed up against the walls, covering their mouths, staring at their hostess as if she were a leper. Victoria's social mask had completely disintegrated, lying on the floor surrounded by broken glass, her makeup smeared and her dress torn. She no longer resembled the queen of high society, but rather what she truly was, a cornered criminal. Two uniformed police officers entered the room, weapons drawn and pointed at the floor, ready for action. Behind them came a man in civilian clothes with a badge on his belt and a weathered face. Detective Inspector Ribas. Alexander stepped forward, raising his open hands to show he wasn't a threat, even though his shirt was still stained with his own blood and the grime from the basement. "I'm Alexander Montalvo, the owner of the house," he said firmly, controlling the adrenaline that urged him to destroy everything. "I made the call." Inspector Ribas scanned the room in a second. The broken glass, the woman on the floor, the terrified guests, and most importantly, the housekeeper protecting the child on the sofa. His gaze finally settled on the television screen. "What is this?" Ribas asked, pointing at the video. "Evidence," Alexander replied, pointing at Victoria. "Unlawful detention of a minor, aggravated physical abuse, financial fraud, and administration of controlled substances without a prescription." Victoria tried to get up, bracing herself against the broken table, her hands bleeding from superficial cuts. Her narcissistic survival instinct kicked in with desperate force. "Officer," she cried, pointing at Alexander with a trembling finger. "This man is crazy. He attacked me. Look what he did to me. It's a setup. That video is fake. It's a computer trick. He wants to take my money." "I am Victoria Velasco. My family owns the construction companies in the north. You don't know who you're messing with." The inspector looked at Alexander. Alexander said nothing. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the lab report he had received on his phone, now printed on a sheet of paper that he had picked up from his office before going downstairs. He handed it to the officer. "This morning's toxicology report," Alexander said coldly. My 6-year-old son has enough sedatives in his blood to knock out a horse. Clinophenol and diazepam, traces of cumulative poison. If you search that woman's handbag or her dress pocket, you'll find the key to the basement where she had him locked up 10 minutes ago. And if you search the guest bathroom, you'll find the unlabeled bottles. Ribas read the paper, his eyebrows furrowed. He looked at Charlie, who was still clinging to Grace, pale and with dark circles under his eyes. Then he looked at Victoria. The doubt vanished from his eyes. He gestured sharply to his men. Handcuff her. Victoria let out a shriek as one of the officers grabbed her arm and roughly pulled her off the floor. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around her wrist echoed in the silent room like the hammer blow of justice. "Let me go, you brute!" Victoria screamed, kicking her legs. "I'll call my lawyer. I'm going to ruin everyone's career. Alexander, tell them to stop. I am the mother of your child." "You're nobody's mother," Alexander said, stepping closer to her until his face was inches from hers. His voice was low, chilling. "You're a parasite. And I promise you, Victoria, I'm going to spend every last penny of my fortune to make sure you spend the rest of your youth in a 3x3 cell. No luxuries, no friends, no way out." Victoria looked around, searching for support among her guests, her closest friends. "Help me," she pleaded. "Say something. You saw how he attacked me." The blonde woman with the jewelry, the one who had laughed at the package earlier, looked away and pulled out her phone, not to call a lawyer, but to record the arrest. "Don't drag us into this, Victoria," she said disdainfully. "Drugs and child abuse. That's too low, even for you. You disgust us." The final betrayal broke Victoria. She began shouting insults, cursing everyone, revealing her true venomous nature as the officers dragged her toward the door. She walked past the sofa where Charlie sat. The boy, who had been hiding his face, turned to look at her. There was no fear in his eyes this time, only a quiet curiosity. He saw the witch tied up. He saw that she no longer had any power. "It's your fault, you damn freak!" Victoria spat at the boy as they shoved her out. "I wish you had died in that basement." Inspector Ribas pushed Victoria roughly toward the exit, cutting off her screams. "Take her away and call in a forensic unit to document the basement. I want photos of every corner." Alexander watched as they took away the woman who had almost destroyed his life. He felt no pity, no love, only an immense emptiness that quickly filled with a painful relief. He turned to the guests, who were still standing there like statues of salt. "Get out of my house," Alexander ordered, pointing at the broken door. "And if I see any of those photos on social media, my lawyers will come after you for complicity. You knew what was happening and you laughed. Get out." The women stampeded out, stumbling in their heels, fleeing the scene of the crime like rats abandoning a ship. The room was suddenly empty, save for the two officers guarding the entrance, Alexander, Grace, and Charlie. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It was the clean silence that remains after a violent storm. Alexander stood in the middle of the wrecked room, breathing heavily, as if he had just run a marathon. His hands, which had been steady during the confrontation, began to tremble. The adrenaline was dissipating, giving way to the emotional reality of the moment. He looked at his bloodied knuckles, then at the television screen, which was now black, and finally turned his head toward the sofa. Grace was still there, kneeling on the crystal-studded Persian rug, her arms around Charlie. The clerk was trembling. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the shock was settling in. She, a humble woman who needed this job to survive, had just punched her boss's fiancé. She had disobeyed direct orders and had been involved in a police scandal. In her mind, despite having done the right thing, the logic of fear told her that her life was ruined. "Sir," Grace whispered, lowering her head and trying to gently release Charlie. "I'm going to get my things. I'm so sorry about the mess, the table, the shouting. I didn't want to cause any problems. I'll leave through the service entrance so the police don't see." Alexander looked at her, stunned by what he was hearing. Go? That woman had just saved his son's life. She had stepped between a monster and a defenseless child. She had received insults, threats, and was almost beaten, and her first concern was apologizing for a broken table. "What?" Alexander walked toward her, his footsteps crunching on the shards of glass. Grace shrank back, interpreting his approach as the prelude to being fired. "You don't need to pay me for the week, sir. I understand that this is a big problem. Just let me go." Alexander fell to his knees in front of her. He didn't duck, he collapsed. His knees hit the hard floor, ignoring the shards of glass that were digging into the fabric of his trousers. He was on par with Grace and Charlie. For the first time, the great businessman, the untouchable millionaire, was on the same level as his domestic worker. "Grace, look at me, we see," he said, his voice breaking with the tears he could no longer hold back. She looked up, startled, and met Alexander's eyes, filled with a gratitude so profound it hurt to see it. "You're not going anywhere," Alexander said, taking her hands. Those rough hands from work, still wearing the yellow marigold gloves, ridiculous and heroic at the same time. "You saved my son. You saw what I refused to see. You defended him when I was blind. If anyone here needs to apologize, it's me." Alexander let go of her hands and looked at Charlie. His son was watching him with a new intensity. The drug-induced haze in his eyes was gone. There was recognition, a silent judgment. "Charlie." Alexander held out his hand, afraid of being rejected. He had a right to be rejected. He had let that woman into their lives. "Forgive me, champ. Dad was a fool. Dad didn't protect you. But I swear on your mother's memory that no one will ever hurt you again. It's going to hurt, but you'll never be afraid in your own home again." Charlie looked at his father's hand, then at Grace. She smiled at him through her tears and nodded slightly, giving him permission, reassuring him. And then it happened. Charlie pulled away from Grace's embrace, didn't crawl, stood on the rug, a little unsteady from the weakness in his numb open legs, but keeping his balance, took a step toward Alexander, then another. "Dad," Charlie said clearly. The boy lunged forward and Alexander caught him in midair, hugging him with desperate strength, burying his face in his son's small neck, crying like a child. He felt Charlie's little arms wrap around his neck, squeezing, comforting. It wasn't the embrace of a sick child. It was the embrace of a survivor. "Are you here? Are you here?" Alexander repeated, rocking him. Grace watched the scene, feeling like an intruder in that intimate moment, but unable to move. She felt exhausted, empty, but at the same time filled with a strange warmth. She slowly took off her yellow gloves, leaving them on the broken table. They were the symbol of her former life, of her submission. Alexander looked up, still holding Charlie in his arms, and glanced at Grace. "Grace," said Alexander, wiping his tears with the back of his hand, "I will have my lawyers draft a new contract tomorrow. You'll never clean floors again. You will not wear a uniform. I want you to be Charlie's legal guardian. I want you to live here with us as part of the family. I want him to grow up with the only person who had the courage to love him when no one else did." "Sir, I have no education. I don't know how to be a tutor," she stammered, overwhelmed. "You taught him to laugh," said Alexander, standing up with Charlie in his arms. "That's more than any university can teach. Please don't leave us. We need you." Charlie, from his father's arms, stretched out a hand toward Grace with his fingers open, inviting her. "Grace," said the boy. Grace burst into tears again, but this time they weren't tears of fear. She nodded, unable to speak, and took Charlie's small hand. The three of them formed a circle amidst the destruction of the room, a nucleus of humanity surrounded by ruins. Outside, the night was dark, but inside, for the first time in years, it felt like dawn was breaking. Victoria's nightmare was over, but the real healing was just beginning. Alexander looked at his son and the woman who had saved him. He knew that although he had lost his fiancée and his social reputation in the eyes of those false friends, he had gained something infinitely more valuable: a second chance to be a father. "Let's go to sleep," Alexander said softly. "But not here. Let's go to a hotel. This house needs to be cleansed of bad memories." The three of them left through the front door, leaving behind the broken glass, the yellow gloves on the table, and the echo of the sirens, walking toward an uncertain but free future. 6 months may seem like a blink of an eye in the history of time, But for the Montalvo family, the last 180 days had been a lifetime compressed into a painful, yet beautiful rebuilding process. The mansion, which had once stood as a cold monument to loneliness and neglect, had changed. It wasn't just a matter of decor, although the hostile designer furniture and sharp glass surfaces had disappeared, replaced by spacious sofas upholstered in soft fabric, plush rugs where one could lie down without fear, and walls painted in warm colors. The real change was in the air. The house no longer smelled of industrial cleaning chemicals and expensive perfumes worn by cruel women. Now it smelled of freshly baked bread, old wood, open books, and life. Alexander was standing on the terrace, leaning against the wooden railing, gazing at the horizon where the afternoon sun was beginning to paint the sky in shades of orange and violet. He was no longer wearing the three-piece suit he used to wear as armor against the world. He wore comfortable linen trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked younger, not because he had fewer wrinkles. In fact, the last few months of trials and therapy had added a few more gray hairs to his beard, but because the perpetual tension that furrowed his brow was gone. His thoughts drifted briefly to the end of the legal proceedings, a memory that still held a bittersweet taste. He recalled the image of Victoria in court just 2 weeks ago. She was no longer the imposing and arrogant woman who dominated charity galas. Dressed in the gray uniform of defendants, without makeup, with dull hair and an empty gaze, she was a shadow of her former self. The sentence had been merciless. 15 years in prison without parole for aggravated child abuse, drug trafficking, crimes against a minor, and massive fraud. The judge had shown no mercy, especially after watching the videos. Victoria's friends had testified against her to save their own reputations, and the society she so revered had spat on her and forgotten her in record time. Justice was served, yes, but the real victory hadn't happened in a courtroom. The real victory was happening right now, a few feet away from where Alexander stood. "Dad, look at this!" Charlie's voice broke through his thoughts, clear and vibrant like a bell. Alexander turned and felt that pang of incredulous happiness that still struck him whenever he heard his son speak fluently. In the middle of the garden, the same garden where it had all begun, Charlie was running after a football. There was no longer a red wheelchair gathering dust in a corner. That chair had been donated to a hospital the very day the doctors confirmed that the muscular atrophy was completely reversible. Charlie had gained weight. His cheeks were the rosy color of health, and his eyes shone with a voracious intelligence. The detox process had been hell. Nights of fever, tremors, nightmares, where the boy screamed, begging them not to give him the drops, but they hadn't gone through it alone. Alexander glanced at the figure running beside Charlie. Grace. She wasn't the same either. The synthetic blue pinafore apron and yellow marigold gloves were a thing of the past, metaphorically burned in the bonfire of her old life. Grace wore a simple floral dress, her hair loose and falling over her shoulders in natural waves. She looked radiant. In the last 6 months, Alexander had kept his word and then some. Grace hadn't just become Charlie's legal guardian. She'd started studying child psychology at university in the mornings, demonstrating a brilliant and empathetic mind that had been wasted scrubbing floors. But beyond her studies, she had become the emotional pillar of the house. Grace intercepted the ball with a laugh, skillfully passing it to Charlie. "Good job, Charlie," she exclaimed. "Now kick hard towards the goal." Charlie got ready, concentrating, sticking his tongue out slightly in an adorable gesture of effort, and kicked the ball with all his might towards the makeshift goal between two trees. "Goal!" shouted the boy, raising his arms to the sky, imitating the celebrations he saw on television with his father on Sundays. Alexander went down the terrace steps and walked towards them, feeling the cool grass under his bare feet. Seeing him approach, Charlie ran towards him and threw himself at his legs. Alexander effortlessly lifted him into the air, spinning him around as the boy laughed heartily. That laugh, the same laugh that 6 months earlier had saved both their lives. "You're a champion, Charlie," Alexander said, kissing his son's sweaty forehead. "The coach says you're the fastest on the team." "That's because Grace coaches me," Charlie said seriously, pointing at her. "She runs really fast. She says she learned to run so she wouldn't miss the bus." Alexander looked at Grace, and they shared a knowing smile, a look charged with an intimacy that had grown slowly day by day between morning coffees, homework, and long late-night conversations after Charlie had fallen asleep. It hadn't been an instant movie romance. It had been something deeper, built on mutual respect and shared gratitude. Alexander had had to learn to forgive himself for his past blindness, and Grace had had to learn to trust that not all men in positions of power were like the ones who had humiliated her in the past. "I think Grace has a lot of hidden talents," Alexander said, setting Charlie down. "Why don't you go get some water from the kitchen, champ? Grace and I need to talk for a minute." Charlie looked at them both with that sharp intuition that children who have suffered possess. He smiled mischievously, as if he knew exactly what was going on, and ran off towards the house shouting, "I'm going to get lemonade for everyone." The silence that remained in the garden was not uncomfortable, but electric. The sun was setting, bathing Grace in a golden light that made her look like an earthly angel. She crossed her arms, a little nervous, looking away at the flowers she had replanted herself. "The lawyer called today," Alexander said, breaking the silence and taking another step closer to her. "Oh, yes." Grace looked up, worried. "Did something happen with the custody? Did Victoria appeal?" "No," Alexander shook his head gently. "Quite the opposite. Full custody is mine, irrevocable, and the restraining order is permanent. But he called about something else. Your employment contract papers?" Grace's expression darkened slightly. The subject of her employment had always been a gray area. Alexander paid her a generous salary as a tutor, but she felt strange receiving money for loving Charlie. "Oh, I see. If you need to adjust anything, sir. Alexander? I need to adjust everything, Grace," he said, taking another step. He was now close enough to smell her perfume, a blend of vanilla and freshness that had become his favorite scent. "I want to terminate the contract." Grace paled. The old fear, the fear of instability, flashed in her eyes for a second. "Terminate it? But I did something wrong? I thought Charlie was progressing well. His grades are excellent, and the therapist says that—" "Grace, stop." Alexander reached out and took her hands. They were warm and soft. There was no trace left of the harshness of the detergents. "I'm not firing you. I'm setting you free. I don't want you to be my employee. I don't want you to receive a salary for being here. That creates a barrier, a hierarchy that no longer exists and that I don't want to exist." "I don't understand," she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Alexander sighed, searching for the right words. He had closed multi-million-dollar deals without batting an eye, but this was the most important thing he had ever negotiated. "When I arrived that day and saw you on the lawn with Charlie, I didn't just see a woman taking care of a child. I saw what was missing from this house. I saw what was missing from my soul. During these 6 months, you have taught me how to be a father. You have taught me that money is worthless if you don't have anyone to share laughter with. You saved me, Grace, both of us." Grace felt tears welling in her eyes. "You saved me, Alexander. I had nothing. I was alone in the world. Charlie gave me a purpose." "So stay," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a husky, vulnerable tone. "But not as a tutor, not as a nanny. Stay as the owner of this house. Stay as my partner." Alexander released one of her hands and reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a snazzy diamond ring. He knew Grace didn't like those things. He took out a small velvet box and opened it. Inside was a simple white gold pendant with a small figurine, a paper airplane. The symbol of that first day, the airplane symbol, Charlie's first word, the beginning of their freedom. "I'm not asking you to marry me yet because I know you need to finish your studies and forge your own path," Alexander said, placing the pendant on her hand. "But I am asking you to try to be a family, a real one, without contracts, just the three of us." Grace looked at the small gold airplane and then at Alexander. All her doubts, all her fears about his humble origins and the class difference dissolved before his honesty, brutal from that man who had learned to love again. "An airplane," she smiled, tears rolling down her cheeks. "So we can fly together," he replied. Grace closed her fist around the pendant and nodded, unable to speak, and threw herself into his arms. Alexander received her with the strength of someone who finds water in the desert. The kiss was slow, sweet, full of promises and a bright future. It wasn't a Hollywood movie kiss. It was a real kiss between two adults who had survived their own shipwrecks and had found each other on the shore. Hey, they're kissing. Disgusting. Charlie's voice interrupted them, and they both separated, laughing. The boy was at the terrace door holding a tray with 3 glasses of lemonade that were wobbly. There was no trauma in his voice, just the healthy teasing of a 6-year-old boy watching his father act like a lovesick teenager. Come here, little critic, Alexander said, beckoning him. Charlie ran toward them, leaving the tray on a garden table, a miracle nothing fell, and jumped into the middle of the hug. The 3 of them stayed there in the center of the garden as the sun finished setting. Alexander looked at his healthy and happy son. He looked at Grace, the woman who had brought the light, and thought about how ironic fate was. He had spent his life seeking financial success, building empires, believing that happiness could be bought or built with expensive bricks. And in the end, happiness had entered his life through the service entrance, wearing a cheap pinafore and yellow gloves to teach him that true wealth is not kept in the bank, but found in simple moments. One sunny afternoon, a child's laughter, and the absolute certainty that whatever happened, they would never be alone again. You know what? Charlie said, looking at the sky that was beginning to show the first stars. I think we should go to the beach tomorrow. Grace has never seen the sea. Alexander looked at Grace in surprise. It's true? She shrugged, blushing. I never left the city much. The sea was always a distant dream. Alexander smiled, a wide, genuine smile. Well, pack your bags, future psychologist. Tomorrow we're going to the beach and the next day to the mountains. We have a whole lifetime to make up for lost time. And as they walked back to the house with the warm lights turning on inside, inviting them into a home that was finally a home, Alexander knew that this time the ending of the story was not a happily ever after. It was something better. They were still there, they were brave, and they truly lived. The door closed behind them, leaving darkness outside, and the garden fell silent, keeping the secret of how a pair of yellow gloves changed the fate of 3 souls forever.